Well, hello everyone. Mr. Joe, it is time for lesson number 13.
13?
We are at the end of the quarter, and it seems like we have done a lot of these videos. I know that we have, but this is the very last one that we're doing because next Sunday, Lord willing, we're having Bible classes again.
That's right. Back to Bible classes. I'm excited about that for the adults. I'm really excited about that for the kids.
I am too. Mainly because they don't have to listen to you and me anymore.
Right.
They can get back to having things back to normal and having their good teachers again. The teachers work so hard in the kids' classes, and I know they're excited about having the kids back. Now, Mr. Joe, this quarter we have talked about the books of Joshua, and we talked about Israel dividing the land, conquering the land, and then dividing the land. And we talked about stories from the book of Judges.
Yes.
And we talked about characters like Ehud and Deborah and Gideon and Samson and the judges who were ruling over Israel. But now, in this last lesson of the quarter, we are changing to a new book.
We are.
And a different Bible story. And, you know, this is one of my favorite Bible stories in the Old Testament. This is a story from the book of Ruth. And this is a story about family, about love, about doing the right thing. There's just so many good things in this story that teach us good lessons to learn.
Right. You know, if we will choose to do what's right in the eyes of God, do you know some things just work out well?
You mean they just work out?
I don't think they just work out.
Yeah.
I think they work out well because when we are on God's side, we have to remember He is on our side.
That's right. So I think the word that we might say there is providence. And the book of Ruth is a great example of God's providence and care for His people.
When we start into the story here about Ruth, you know, I think it's kind of a sad start to the story.
That's right.
You know, and as you get into the story, you think like, oh no, how can this go well? But by the time we come to the end of the story, there's some happiness that is found. And again, I have to believe that's part of God's plan.
I think that's right. So let's get into the story.
Let's talk about the story. So we are starting talking about an Israelite man named Elimelech.
Wait, what? Say that again?
Yeah, Elimelech.
Elimelech.
Yeah.
Man, that's a mouthful.
It is.
Okay.
Elimelech.
So what about Elimelech?
Well, he's married to a woman named Naomi.
Not so hard.
Naomi.
Yeah, okay.
And of course, they moved from Israel to Moab. Now, there was a reason for that. If you remember on some of our early maps, you have Israel and the 12 tribes. Well, Moab is one of those places farther down to the south is where that is at. Well, now, there was a reason why they left Israel.
Property values in Moab were better.
I don't think that was the part of it.
Oh, okay.
You know, but property values probably got low in Israel because people were hungry. There was a famine going on.
Oh.
But now,
you mean there was no food?
No food. You see, that's what a famine is. You know, there was not enough food for everyone in the land. And so people started leaving, like Elimelech and Naomi. You know, they and their family, they moved south down to Moab because Moab had a lot of food. And Israel did not. And so when they moved there in the land of Moab, Elimelech and Naomi's sons married Moabite women. Now their names were Orpah, I said it wrong again. Say it for me.
Orpah. Not Oprah. Not okra. Orpah.
Can you remember that? Orpah.
I think this is going to be a struggle throughout the video.
I think it will be. Orpah and Ruth.
It's a good thing she's not in the story very long.
That's right. That's right. Ruth becomes our character, and I can remember her name. So in time, Elimelech and his two sons, they all died.
The father and the two sons?
Yes, the father and the sons. So that leaves Naomi and Orpah and Ruth all as widows.
Wow.
And in a strange land for Naomi.
Right.
Because, she wasn't from there. And so Naomi wanted to go home. That is, back to Israel. She wanted to go home back to Israel. And so she told the two girls who were her daughter-in-laws, She told them that she would understand if they wanted to stay in Moab, because that's where their people were from, and that's where they were born. Orpah decided to stay. But Ruth said she would go to Israel with Naomi. Now Ruth told Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." That's what she said, okay? Now Ruth had learned about God, because of her in-laws, and she wanted to serve him. And also, I think she loved Naomi.
And isn't that a beautiful passage in the book of Ruth?
Is.
When Ruth says that to Naomi, "I'll go wherever you go. Your people, your family, your Israelite people will become my people, and I will worship the same God that you worship." Remember, Ruth was a Moabite woman. She was not an Israelite. She did not know the God of Israel. And so this is really a remarkable thing that she says to Naomi.
She didn't know the God of Israel until Naomi came into her life.
That's right, that's right. All right, so Naomi and Ruth are going to go back to Israel.
Right.
Naomi's home, not Ruth's home, but it will become that
That's right.
soon enough. And when they got back to Israel, it was the time of year, it was harvest time. It was the time when people were out collecting the grain and the wheat from their fields, and they were going to be using that for food. But wait a minute, wasn't it a famine that took them away from their home years before? But now the famine is over and the food is growing again. And so it's harvest time. Now, this is interesting, Mr. Joe. The law of Moses that God gave to the people, it made provisions for people who were landowners. And it said that you have to leave the corners of your fields for people who are less fortunate, for people who are strangers, for people who are needy, and that they could come through and that they could take a little bit of grain from that small portion of the field that you have left. That was called gleaning.
Right.
And here with Naomi and Ruth, they come back to the land of Israel, but Naomi,
what do they have?
They have nothing. And Ruth, they have nothing. So they have no they have no money, they have no riches or wealth. How are they going to be provided for? Well, they're going to go and glean in the fields of someone else. That's right.
Yeah, God made a provision.
Now, Naomi is not going to be the one doing the gleaning. Ruth is going to do that.
Well,
and
because
Ruth,
Naomi is much older.
That's right, and she can't do it. And so Ruth is going to go into another person's field, a stranger's, of course a stranger, because Ruth isn't from here.
Right.
She goes into the field of a stranger and she starts collecting grain.
Right.
But the man whose field she went into turned out to not be a stranger at all.
Well, not to Naomi. Because
that's right.
It was kinfolk to
That's
Naomi.
right. That's right. She ended up in the field of a man named Boaz, who was actually a relative of Naomi, not Ruth, but Naomi. He was a relative of hers. And Boaz knew about this woman, this strange woman that he'd never seen before, who was out in his fields collecting grain. And he had heard about Ruth, and he told his servants, he said, "Leave her alone. Let her take as much as she wants. Don't bother her, and make sure that she has plenty of grain." And he did that because Boaz was a very good man.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So Boaz, God made provisions for this in his law, but Boaz is one who knows and is following God's law.
That's right.
And so he's helping now to take care of their needs.
Can I add something here? You said Boaz is someone who knows God's law and is following God's law. Something that I meant to mention at the very beginning of the video, but I forgot. We need to mention that the story of Ruth happens during the time of the book of Judges. And do you remember the third memory verse that we've been working on this quarter? I know you do. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so Boaz lives among a people who are not following God's laws. And that's why the cycle that we've talked so much about was happening again and again. And yet Boaz was a man who served God even when people around him were not.
Sometimes, even in the worst of times, when it appears that most people do not care about God, and most people are not willing to follow his way and his laws, always there are some who love God and who are willing to follow him.
That's right.
Boaz was that kind of a man.
We need to make sure that we're that kind of person too.
Absolutely. Under God's law, when a man died, it was the responsibility of his closest relative to take care of that woman and her family. You see, there was
a widow.
If there was a widow,
okay.
You see, so if there was a man who died, his closest relative is to watch over her, to make sure she has what she needs,
and maybe even marry her if
that's right.
Instance
that's exactly right.
Okay.
To take care of her in that way, And so there were times when women didn't have anyone to take care of them, and she might have a real hard time surviving. And so Naomi and Ruth were both kind of in that situation. And even though Boaz was not a relative to Ruth, he was a relative to Naomi. And I think he accepted some responsibilities here, you see, because of that. And so, Boaz even went so far as to check with some other men in town to see who might be a relative here. And in fact, there was another man who was a closer relative, but that man said that he was not willing to take on the responsibility. And so Boaz, this tells us something more about Boaz. Again, Boaz stood up and said, I'll take care. I'll take care of them. And so that's what he did. So what did he do?
Yeah. So what Boaz does is he decides to marry Ruth.
That's right.
He takes Ruth to be his wife, but then by extension he also takes care of Naomi, making sure that she has what she needs as well. Boaz and Ruth loved each other very much, and I think that one of the reasons that they loved each other so much is because they both loved God very much, and they put God first and wanted to do what he wanted them to do.
Right.
Now, Boaz and Ruth would later have a son, and his name was Obed. And Obed would later have a son named Jesse, and Jesse would later have a son whose name was David. Yeah, King David.
Yes.
And King David was the great-grandson of Ruth in this story.
That's right.
And so because Boaz had a great love for Ruth, and Ruth for Boaz, and both of them for the Lord, they built a life together, a life that was blessed by God. And Boaz saved Ruth and Naomi from a very hard life, a very difficult life. God took care of Ruth and Naomi through the good actions and choices of Boaz.
That's right.
So let's think about how this story began. You said it started on a very sad note.
I thought it does. Or it did, because, there was the death of Naomi's husband and the two daughter-in-laws, or Naomi's sons died. Boy, that's just sad. And sometimes you get into a story like that and you think, I don't even want to read anymore because this is just going to be too sad.
Yeah.
But, in the end, by God's providence, this turns out to be a very happy story that has far-reaching effects.
That's right.
And to think about it, at the beginning of the story, Boaz and Ruth, they didn't even know each other. They lived in different countries. And yet one of the things that pulled them and drew them together was the desire to follow God. And we see this in the life of Boaz, that he was a good man. We see we see Ruth, when she was willing to travel with Naomi to Israel, that she'd already set her mind on the fact, I will serve your God, Jehovah God. She had learned enough about Jehovah God to say, I will serve him. And it's not just by some strange coincidence that they came together. I'm convinced.
Yeah, that's right. So we started off with a famine. We started off with Elimelech dying, then the two sons dying. Naomi has lost the three men in her life that she loves the most. And then she loses a daughter-in-law in Orpah who decides to stay there in Moab. And all she has left is Ruth. And that's, well, as the book of Ruth says, that turned out to be a better deal than she could have ever imagined.
Absolutely.
So Ruth finds Boaz, and she marries Boaz, and she has a family with Boaz, and they build a life together. And so Ruth finds happiness again. And then Naomi, who's lost her husband, who's lost her sons, she becomes a grandmother.
That's right.
And she finds great happiness in her grandson.
Absolutely. I like this story.
I do too. It's one of my favorites in all of the Old Testament. It's a story about love and family and doing the right thing.
Sure. So Wednesday night, God willing, boy, there's some interesting questions that can come out of this story right here.
Yeah, like Okra, the daughter. Wait a minute,
No.
that wasn't her name.
Orpah.
We'll throw in some questions about names probably. So we'll just do the best we can on spelling. Okay?
Oh, right.
All right. Well, Mr. Joe, this has been a really good study. This entire quarter, we've talked about some great Bible stories and some great men and women who served God, and they are examples to us on how we should serve God as well.
That's right. Let's just set our minds to being the people of God, to obeying Him. And if we do, in time, we can truly be God's people.
That's right. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. We hope to see you soon.